Before we begin, if you appreciate deep historical stories and carefully researched documentaries, support the channel by subscribing and leaving a like. It helps these stories reach more people and keeps new episodes coming. Now let's return to a moment when the world stood on the edge of collapse. Normandy and the Western Front, opening the road to victory. By 1944, the Second World War had reached a critical stage. The momentum on the Eastern Front had shifted, but victory was far from guaranteed. To end the war, a second massive front had to be opened in Western Europe. What followed would become one of the most complex and decisive military operations in history. The long preparation. The invasion of Western Europe was not improvised. For years, resources, troops, and equipment were gathered in secrecy. Entire armies trained for a single moment. Deception operations were launched to confuse the enemy about the location and timing of the attack. Fake armies, false radio traffic, and misleading intelligence created an illusion that kept defenders guessing until the last possible moment. Every detail mattered. Tides, weather, moonlight, logistics, and timing. Failure would mean disaster on an unprecedented scale. Success would mean a turning point that could shorten the war by years. D-Day. The longest day. On June 6, 1944, the invasion began on the beaches of Normandy. Before dawn, airborne forces dropped behind enemy lines to secure bridges and disrupt communications. As the sun rose, thousands of ships appeared on the horizon. The beaches became killing grounds. Some landing zones were lightly defended, while others were fortified with machine guns, artillery, and obstacles. Soldiers advanced through surf and smoke under relentless fire. Many never made it past the shoreline. Despite chaos and heavy losses, footholds were secured. By nightfall, the invasion had not failed, and that alone was a victory. Holding the beachhead landing was only the beginning. For weeks, forces fought to expand their positions inland. The countryside turned into a maze of hedgerows, narrow roads, and fortified villages. Progress was slow and costly. Every field became a battlefield. Tanks struggled to maneuver. Infantry fought at close range. Air power and artillery were used relentlessly, reshaping the landscape itself. Yet slowly, pressure mounted. Supplies poured in. Reinforcements arrived. The bridgehead grew stronger with each passing day. Breaking out of Normandy. The stalemate ended with a massive breakout operation. Concentrated firepower shattered defensive lines, allowing armored units to push rapidly into open terrain. What followed was a collapse rather than an organized retreat. Enemy forces were encircled and destroyed in pockets. Roads filled with abandoned equipment. The speed of advance stunned even those leading it. The liberation of Paris soon followed, a powerful symbolic victory that echoed across the world. The advance across Western Europe. With France liberated, the war moved eastward. Cities fell one by one. Resistance varied, but the direction was clear. Industrial centers, ports, and supply routes became priority targets. However, victory was not without setbacks. A final major counteroffensive attempted to split advancing forces and reverse the situation. Fierce fighting followed in forests and frozen terrain. Once again, endurance proved decisive. When the counterattack failed, it marked the last serious attempt to change the course of the war in the West. The air and the home front. Throughout the Western Front campaign, air superiority played a crucial role. Supply lines were disrupted. Transportation networks collapsed. Cities and factories were targeted relentlessly. Civilians endured constant danger. Entire urban centers were reduced to rubble. While air power accelerated victory, it also raised profound moral questions that would echo long after the war ended. The road to the heart of Europe. By early 1945, advancing armies stood at the gates of the enemy's core territories. The Western and Eastern fronts were moving toward each other, closing a tightening circle. What remained was inevitable, but still costly. The final battles would be the most destructive of all, fought not for territory, but for the end of the war itself. Why the Western Front mattered. The Normandy invasion and the Western Front achieved what years of fighting could not alone. They forced a two-front collapse. They accelerated the end of the war. They demonstrated the power of coordination and logistics. They reshaped modern military planning. Most importantly, they brought the war home to the very heart of the regime that had begun it. Approaching the end. As armies advanced deeper into Europe, the reality became unavoidable. The war was ending, but not quietly. The final chapter would be written in ruins, desperation, and silence. The Pacific War. Midway, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, and the price of victory. While the war in Europe moved toward its conclusion, a very different struggle raged across the vast distances of the Pacific. This was a war defined by oceans instead of borders, by islands instead of cities, and by endurance pushed to its absolute limits. Victory here would not come quickly, and it would not come cheaply. A war across an endless ocean. The Pacific theater was shaped by geography. Thousands of islands stretched across immense distances, each one a potential airfield, naval base, or fortress. Control of these islands meant control of the skies and sea lanes. Losing them meant isolation and collapse. Naval power and air power were everything. Traditional land campaigns were replaced by amphibious assaults, carrier battles, and long-range bombing. Supply lines stretched thin. Every operation depended on logistics, timing, and absolute coordination. Midway. The battle that changed the Pacific. The first great turning point came at the Battle of Midway. Unlike earlier clashes, this battle was decided almost entirely by intelligence, timing, and air power. Opposing fleets never met directly. Instead, aircraft launched from carriers struck with devastating precision. In a matter of hours, the balance of naval power shifted. Multiple carriers were destroyed, along with experienced air crews that could never be replaced. Midway ended the era of unchecked expansion. From this point on, initiative slowly changed hands. The war in the Pacific became a long, grinding advance rather than a rapid conquest. Island hopping, a strategy of attrition. Rather than attacking every stronghold, a new strategy emerged. Key islands were seized, while others were bypassed and left isolated. Cut off from supplies, many garrisons were effectively neutralized without direct assault. Each landing was a calculated risk. Beaches were fortified. Terrain was hostile. Jungles, volcanic rock, and coral reefs turned every movement into a struggle. The enemy was often unseen, entrenched deep underground. This was warfare at close range. Victory came not through sweeping maneuvers, but through relentless pressure and adaptation. Iwo Jima, a battlefield without refuge. The assault on Iwo Jima revealed the true nature of the Pacific War. The island was small, but it was fortified into a single, massive defense system. There was no safe rear area. Underground tunnels allowed defenders to strike unexpectedly and disappear. Every meter of ground was contested. Progress was measured in days, not miles. The iconic image of a flag raised above the battlefield captured a moment of victory, but not the reality that followed. Fighting continued long after that moment. Losses were severe on both sides, and the psychological toll was immense. Iwo Jima demonstrated a brutal truth. Even a single island could cost thousands of lives. Okinawa. The final warning. The battle for Okinawa was the largest and most destructive land battle of the Pacific War. It was also a preview of what an invasion of the main islands might look like. The fighting lasted for months. Weather turned battlefields into mud. Civilian populations were trapped between advancing forces and defensive positions. Naval forces faced relentless air attacks, including suicide missions aimed at ships offshore. Casualties reached staggering levels. The distinction between front lines and rear areas vanished. By the end, the island was devastated, and the cost raised urgent questions about how the war could be ended. The human cost of the Pacific War. Unlike Europe, surrender in the Pacific was rare. Fighting often continued until one side was destroyed. This created a cycle of violence that intensified with each battle. Soldiers endured extreme conditions: heat, disease, exhaustion, and constant threat. Civilians suffered displacement, starvation, and loss on a massive scale. Entire communities were erased. The psychological impact lingered long after the fighting stopped. Survivors carried memories of battles where survival itself felt uncertain until the final moment. Air power and the endgame. As island bases moved closer to the heart of enemy territory, air power became decisive. Long-range bombing campaigns targeted industry and infrastructure, bringing the war directly to civilian centers. Cities burned. Production collapsed. The line between military and civilian targets blurred completely. The question was no longer whether victory was possible, but what price would be paid to achieve it. Why the Pacific battles mattered. The Pacific War reshaped modern warfare. Aircraft carriers replaced battleships as the dominant naval force. Amphibious warfare became central to global strategy. Air power proved capable of deciding wars independently. The human cost forced a re-evaluation of how wars could be ended. Most importantly, these battles pushed the conflict toward a final, irreversible decision. Standing on the edge of the end. By mid-1945, the outcome of the war was no longer in doubt, but the path to peace remained uncertain. The final act would not be defined by a single battle, but by a choice that would change history forever. The war was approaching its conclusion, but the way it would end would shape the world for generations. Berlin and the end of the war. Collapse, silence, and legacy. By the spring of 1945, the Second World War had entered its final and most destructive phase. Across Europe, advancing armies closed in from all directions. Cities lay in ruins, supply lines were shattered, and resistance was crumbling. At the center of it all stood one final objective: Berlin. The final advance. As forces pushed deeper into Central Europe, the scale of destruction intensified. Bridges were blown apart, railways lay twisted and broken, and entire towns were reduced to rubble. Civilians fled westward in endless columns, while defenders, many of them exhausted, undertrained, or barely armed, prepared for a last stand. There was no longer any illusion of victory. The war had become a fight for survival, delay, and escape. The battle for Berlin. The assault on Berlin was unlike any battle before it. The city was transformed into a fortress of ruins. Streets became trenches, buildings became strongpoints, underground tunnels turned into deadly corridors. Fighting was brutal and intimate. Soldiers advanced block by block, floor by floor. Artillery fire never ceased. Smoke and dust filled the air, reducing visibility to mere meters. Civilians sheltered in basements as the city collapsed above them. There were no clear front lines, only chaos. The fall of a capital. As resistance collapsed, symbols of power fell with it. Government buildings were captured. Communication broke down. Units surrendered in isolation, unaware that the war was effectively over. When the fighting finally stopped, Berlin was a shattered shell. What had once been a center of political authority was now a landscape of silence, smoke, and debris. The war in Europe had ended, not with celebration, but with exhaustion. The cost of the final battle. The battle claimed tens of thousands of lives in mere weeks. Soldiers and civilians alike paid the price. Entire neighborhoods were erased. Families were separated forever. Victory came not as triumph, but as relief. The world had survived, but at an unimaginable cost. The end of the war. With Berlin fallen, organized resistance in Europe collapsed. One by one, remaining forces surrendered. Across the continent, weapons were laid down. In the Pacific, fighting would continue briefly, but the global conflict was clearly reaching its conclusion. After nearly 6 years, the most devastating war in human history was over. A world forever changed. The end of the war did not bring instant peace. It left behind a divided world, scarred societies, and questions without easy answers. Borders were redrawn. Nations rebuilt from ashes. New global powers emerged. The memory of destruction shaped international politics, military doctrine, and collective conscience for generations. The legacy of the battles. The battles of the Second World War taught lessons written in blood. That modern war consumes entire societies. That technology can amplify both destruction and survival. That victory often comes at a moral cost. And that peace, once broken, is painfully difficult to restore. These lessons remain relevant, not as distant history, but as warnings. The final silence. When the guns fell silent, the world did not return to what it had been before. Too much had been lost. Too much had changed. The Second World War ended not with a single moment, but with a slow realization that humanity had stood on the edge of total destruction and barely stepped back, and the responsibility to remember would now belong to those who survived.